You're listening to Past Imperfect, a history podcast brought to you by the Center for Wisdom and Leadership at SPJIMR. I'm Dinyar Patel. Today, I speak with Murali Ranganathan, a historian of Mumbai who arguably knows more about the city's 19th and early 20th century history than anyone else. Over the past 15 years, Murali has churned out books and articles which speak to Mumbai's multilingual landscape and to his own skills in reading in and translating from Marathi, Gujarati, Urdu, and Persian. His latest book is The First World War Adventures of Nariman Karkaria, a translation of a riveting account of a Parsi soldier who served on 3 different fronts during World War I. Like many other historical characters Murali has unearthed, Nariman Karkaria traveled the world, but he made Mumbai a constant reference point in his writing. Thank you, Murali, for joining me today. I want to begin with a question about names. So in 1995, Bombay was officially renamed as Mumbai. And the renaming was, of course, instigated by the Shiv Sena, which had come to power in Maharashtra in that year. And since then, naming and renaming has been at the center of debates over the city's competing pulls between cosmopolitanism on one side and ethnic chauvinism on the other side. In many ways, that has been a common theme of Bombay's history or Mumbai's history over the past few decades. Now, for you as a historian of the city, what are your perspectives on how the contemporary debate over the city's names relates to the use of Bombay and Mumbai in historical sources? You've obviously looked at historical sources from, both the 19th century extensively as well as the 20th century. What, if anything, has been the longer politics of naming and renaming in the city?
Hi, Dinyar. Great to be here with you and chatting about Mumbai and other stuff. I think the renaming of the city, was not much of a renaming because for most of recorded history, let's say let's say 1800 onwards, it has always been Mumbai in every other language except in English. If you go and look at the old Persian records, if you look at practically every book in Marathi and Gujarati, it's just been Mumbai. Mumbai, in of course, in various spellings, orthography. If you see the first book which is not printed in English from Bombay. That's from 1798, and it happens to be the Parsi Avesta, and that was printed in the Courier Press in 1798, and that has a byline which says Mamai, Ma-ma-e. That's what it says, and that was the way the Gujaratis pronounced the name of the city. And then you still, even now, it is sometimes called Mumbai by the by the local Christian population. And Mumbai, out there, Mumbai. There are various pronunciations, and so the word Mumbai, is hardly a renaming. It was always the name of the city for almost all its denizens. Of course, the rulers, so to speak, were using at some point of time the transition from the Portuguese Mumbai happened to then became Bombay and then Bombay, and that happened at some point of time, and I'm still trying to figure out that exact document, which where the alphabets were substituted, where the M became a B. This has happened to so many places. If you see, even say road names, there was this Kalika Devi Road in Bombay. Kalika Devi Road still exists, one of the major thoroughfares in the whole city of Bombay. And at some point of time, somebody missed out the I, and it became Kalka Devi. And then some guy started writing that name in English, and at one point of time, that the second K became a B, and now it's called Kalba Devi Road, and everybody is quite happy to use it. Though it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And there is this Kalika Devi temple still on that road. So that's how name changes sometimes happen. And I think the most fantastic name change in Bombay, in the Bombay region, that is, has been Vasai. It used to be called basin in the English records. And that was actually because the Portuguese could not pronounce V, and so for them Vasai became Basai, and Basai with a nasal at the end. That's how they spelled most of their and pronounced most of their names, and Basai became Basaim. And by the time the British got to it in the early 1800s, Basaim became basin. And at some point of time, it must have still been Basaim, but after a few years, it started being pronounced as Basin. And it was called Basin Road, Bassein, for many, many years until it finally became Vasai. So you wouldn't call that a renaming. It was always Vasai. So similarly with Bombay. But I think there are many other things which are operating at various levels. And I think you mentioned some of them. I mean, there is some kind of, chauvinism. There is some kind of desire to imprint yourself on the public sphere. And many of those motivations sort of manifest themselves in many other ways. And one of them is name changing, you want to call it, or call them, or retrieving old names maybe, or just giving new names altogether. I mean, so for example, you have places now which didn't exist earlier, like Upper Worli. I mean, what is Upper Worli, or Lower Cuff Parade, or whatever you want to call that? So there are,
New Cuff
yeah,
Parade.
New Cuff Parade. Sorry, New Cuff Parade. I mean, so there are aspirational names also happening. So there are various motivations for name change. I think one has to sort of live with that. I mean, and sort of understand it. I think you don't have. I think a lot of people felt that the character of the city changed just because it became Mumbai. I completely disagree with that. The character of the city has changed, certainly, no doubt about that, from the 90s. But that is not because of the name change. I think there are so many other factors which were operating in the city which sort of contributed to the character change. But it's certainly not because of the name. Because everybody in Mulund, where I stay, would always say we are going to Mumbai. I mean, in Marathi or in Gujarati. And Mumbai was the city, and then people would use that phrase all the time. So there you are.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that. I mean, obviously today's debates about naming, there's always only one right answer, right? I mean, there's Prayagraj rather than Allahabad or Allahabad or however else you'd want to pronounce it. With regards to renaming different, stations within the city of Bombay, old Anglophone names are chucked out and supposedly authentic names are put in. But the past shows that things were much more heterogeneous, that there were many different names and many different spellings, right? Even many different spellings for places outside of Bombay, right? I mean, uh, even the way people in Bombay would spell other cities like Paris or Calcutta or such would be varied quite a bit. And I recall even in my own research, a place like Bandra would be spelled Bandora occasionally. Of course, Vandere is the other equivalent you see in the sources. So, I mean, that's perhaps something to keep in mind, that in an era where one is correct and everything else is wrong, that's quite at variance with what the historical tradition has been.
I think you're right, and that's a very good point. I think now we're at a stage where everybody wants to be correct. I mean, it's my way or not. No, I mean, I don't want to use the word highway here, but it's the way it is. I mean, and I think that sort of manifests itself in some kind of a much more chauvinistic public culture which has come into play. And you see the renaming of the current, the latest spree of renaming the local stations. I mean, there is a diversity, but there is also a homogeneity to that. I mean, the thought process seems to be homogeneous, while the names might be diverse. Let's put it that way. I mean, you have whatever. I mean, King's Circle, which obviously has a significant colonial connotation to the whole thing. But now to name it with a a Jain religious icon is, I mean, is just pandering to your electorate in some way. I mean, nothing more than that, because there is really no connection between that great man and that place. There you are.
So I want to move on to discussing, from names, and we can get back to names later on, your own personal trajectory as a historian. So you've now published translations of two books, one from Marathi and the other from Gujarati. You've edited two collections of essays and have written numerous articles on everything from Bombay's or Mumbai's print history to 19th century pandemic experiences to travelogues of various residents from Bombay or Mumbai who traveled around the world. And a lot of this, most of it, has been based on reading of very neglected material in things like Marathi, Gujarati, Urdu, and Persian. How did your own interest in Bombay history develop? And how did you begin your career as a historian working with these materials?
Well, you can call me an accidental historian, because I don't really have any formal training in history beyond what I learned in school. And when I decided to do something different, and been reading all my life, so, and history was obviously a major area of interest, and I started reading books in many subjects and many areas of history. When I mean, I spent 6 months in the British Library in London, just sort of sampling this, that, and everything which I could which I could read. And that was the first time I started reading in Marathi and Gujarati and Hindi. I mean, the British Library has a much more extensive collection than literally any Indian library can boast of. And I could literally order up anything which has been published anywhere in India in all these languages. And that sort of gave me, and that is the first time I actually started looking at books on Bombay. I mean, Bombay is a city where I grew up, and it's perhaps the only place where which I can call home. And I started looking up books on the history of Bombay, and I first encountered this book called Mumbai Varnan in the British Library, and things festered for a few more years before I decided to take the plunge and become a full-time reader. I wouldn't call myself a historian at that point, and even now I sort of am hesitating to accept that label. But I became a full-time reader, and then I decided to sort of, literally sort of take my first baby step into the public sphere, so to speak, by translating. I mean, I thought that was a much more easier way to sort of, get into a more serious engagement with the subject rather than writing something on my own. And that proved to be a fairly serious engagement by itself. I mean, translating Mumbai Varnan was really, I mean, it's a 400-page book, and it's packed with all kinds of information about all kinds of things related to the city. And I had to sort of become a expert on everything which Govind Narayan talks about before I could actually make sense of that translation and making start start rendering it in English. And that sort of literally opened up so many more avenues of historical inquiry to me. That specific book. I mean, after it was published in 2008, I decided to look at all the sources which Govind Narayan himself quotes, and he quotes hundreds of sources, and especially all the old Marathi newspapers, the old English newspapers, and many publications which had been published before 1863 when his book in Marathi appeared. And that sort of drew me into so many directions, and that sort of gave me a lot of hooks on which to hang my research on. And that's where my interest in the city's history, as well as the history of Western India and India in general, sort of developed.
So following up on that, I'm going to ask you two things. One thing on Mumbai itself, and the second on Govind Narayan's Mumbai, which was the book that you had translated based on the biography of Mumbai written in 1863 by Govind Narayan. First, with regards to looking at Bombay or Mumbai, obviously you grew up in the city. Now spent, I think, 15 years studying it in great detail. What is the particular appeal of studying a city like Bombay? What's unique about it, both in terms of its significance in India as well as in the wider world?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't call the history of the city unique in that sense. I think every city has got a unique history in that sense. But finally, you are looking at the way a city develops is different from every other city. But Bombay is, of course, I mean, one of those mega cities of the world. I mean, there is really no getting away from the fact that Bombay was, even in the 1850s, one of the metropolises of the world, and it sort of grew much faster after that. So you really have a I mean, a wealth of material associated with the city, which sort of comes to the formula. For example, if you look at, let's say, an older city like Pune, you would be struggling to get that kind of material from the 19th century. I mean, because it was still not even what you would call it, a large city in that sense. Or if you look at, say, Thane, which is the next city after Bombay, I mean, it has got a much longer history than Bombay does. But
Yeah.
there is, I mean, you wouldn't be able to write a biography of the city at all even now. I mean, because there are so much lacunae. And for many centuries it was just nothing more than a village, for example. But Bombay is, of course, a very recent city. I mean, you find records from 500 years and so on. But as a city, it really has a history of, let's say, 300 to 350 years. And but that period is packed with material. It was one of those, what do you say, places where history happened. I mean, and not many places can boast of such a long period of history happening. And of course, in India, we got quite a few other cities which have similar trajectories. I mean, Chennai, Kolkata, and Bombay are literally, I mean, the growth can literally be mapped quite on each other. I mean, they're very similar trajectories. Kolkata a little ahead, then Madras sometimes, and then from the late 1800s, it was clearly Bombay which was on the growth path. And now, if you, I mean, I just will step forward to the current century. I mean, you find that There are other cities which have taken over from Bombay. I mean, you got Delhi, which is literally sort of exploded from the 1990s onwards, and then you got Bangalore a little later, Hyderabad, Pune. I mean, many of these cities are growing much faster than Bombay is doing, and there is a lot of stuff happening there. So I think you would find that in terms of profusion of material. I mean, that is where sort of, I mean, especially in the modern period. I mean, I'm not talking only about the modern period. The profusion of material related to Bombay is huge, and I think we have still. I mean, there are literally been thousands of people working on this area, and I still feel that there's a lot still to be read, and read and written about and understood. I mean, there is just so much happening here. There's so much which has happened here, and I think even as we speak, I think now we are seeing a different city which is not expanding, but which is sort of gentrifying in so many directions that there is a new kind of history waiting to be written now.
So the second question I wanted to ask was, again, in relation with Govind Narayan and your work at translating. So your translating work has been, both. I mean, obviously, you've translated a number of items, and I know you have a number of items that you haven't published as yet that you're working on for translations. But you mentioned that you encountered Govind Narayan's work in the British Library, and with your most recent work of translation, which was the translation of the World War I memoirs of Nariman Karkaria, a Parsi soldier who fought in World War I. You mentioned also there's quite a unique story of how you found this. To what degree is the work of a translator, especially a translator in a place like India, based on luck and random finds in the archives? I mean, how did you stumble upon this material that you've translated?
Okay. I mean, I think the question you are asking is, how do I choose which text to translate?
Yeah.
I mean, so I think there are translators. For example, there are translators of fiction and modern publications who do a different job. I mean, I think it's a much more challenging job in terms of really negotiating with the author, especially if he knows the language in which it is being translated to. And so I'm not a translator in that sense. I would call myself a historical translator. So I mean, typically I'm dealing with texts where the author has been dead for long. I mean, which sort of solves a lot of problems in a way. I mean, there is no negotiation involved, and I mean, when I choose a text, I'm trying to see if it ticks two boxes. One, is it valuable historical material which nobody else has seen? Two, does it will it be a good read? Will it be a good read for the average person who reads good non-fiction or fiction also sometimes? So if it ticks both these boxes, that's when I start translating. And with Govind Narayan's Mumbai and with Nariman Karkaria's First World War memoir, both these boxes were ticked quite strongly, and uh, and and that's how I chose both those texts, because literally there are hundreds of texts which either take one or the other. But I mean, to engage with any text and sort of devote at least a few months, if not a couple of years, to them, involves sort of being very careful about what it means, and will there be readers, will there be historians who might then use it, and so on. I mean, I am asking quite a few questions before I then decide to translate a text. And with Govind Narayan, I mean, now it's been 15 years since Govind Narayan has been published, and I find that it's been used by professors and teachers all over the world, teaching all kinds of subjects. It's not just history. I mean, literally every subject to do with modern India, modern Western India, everybody is using that text now. So that is something which sort of vindicates my choice, that yes, I mean, this was a book worth translating. And with Nariman Karkaria, I'm quite sure that any historian of the First World War is not going to be able to ignore that book. I mean, that's he. I mean, even if he's just looking at just the Indian contribution, or if he's looking at the broader perspective, because that book literally sprawls all across the world, and I think everybody is going to be using it as it gets read more and more by more and more people, and it sort of gets into curriculum and so on and so forth.
So we'll get into what Karkaria talks about in his book in just a second. But correct me if I'm wrong, but you mentioned that you stumbled upon Karkaria's memoir somewhat by accident, right?
Absolutely. I spend time in libraries trawling for books. I mean, it's not as if I look for a specific title. I mean, I'm looking at the entire collection, trying to understand what it contains, how those books came there, and is there anything which is unique in a particular library. And when I was reading in the K.R. Kama Institute, which is a very major library in Bombay. I've been looking at the catalog for years then. And when I was looking for books on theatre, I mean, so I would look at, the theatre can be translated as Rangbhumi in Marathi and Gujarati, and even Hindi also. And I was looking at titles starting with that word. And that's how I stumbled on this book, which was titled Rangbhumi Par Rakhad, which is basically strolling across stage or whatever. I mean, however you want to call it, translate that. I mean, and uh, and then I started reading it, and I realized that it has got nothing to do with theater, and it's actually it starts off as an autobiography for the first 50 pages, and then it's then sort of gets on to the war front and so on for the next 200 300 pages, and then it becomes a travelogue of sorts at the very end. And I realized this is something which is just absolutely a unique piece of work, which just, I mean, especially in the Indian context, where more than 1 million people were in the First World War. Many of them were at the front lines. Many of them were in the supply lines, but literally hardly any personal voice has ever been excavated. I mean, these were people literally speaking about 50 different languages, and nothing has ever been published or ever been discovered either in manuscript or in the printed form. And this was a unique document, and it was not just unique, it was so substantial. I mean, it was 400 pages of just, fighting the war, the experiences, and what it meant to be a soldier during the 1910s. And even more importantly, it was written in such a style. I mean, the swashbuckling style of his narration was so captivating that, I mean, it didn't take me many months to realize that this is a book which needs to be presented to the world in a translated form.
Yeah, I think there's a degree to which all of us who work on Indian history, um, you know, there's a degree of serendipity in the finds that we discover in the archives, right? We look for something, like you mentioned, you were looking at drama, and obviously the title of this book, starting off with the word Rangbhumi or stage, would indicate something very different than, say, a memoir of World War One. And I think all of us who work on Indian history can relate similar stories of looking for something, discovering something radically different, and
Absolutely.
going off in a very different direction with that. So we'll talk more about this book that you published in 2021 as The First World War Adventures of Nariman Karkaria. As you've noted in the book, and as you just mentioned, right now it's not just about Karkaria's time in World War One, even though that itself is very significant, but it also covers his life as a traveler, and it's overall an incredible story, right? I mean, he traveled by train from Beijing to London, train and boat, used the Trans-Siberian Railway during war. He fought on or served on 3 different fronts in the First World War, fought in the Battle of the Somme, and most incredibly, actually lived through all of these things in order to tell the tale. Why do you think this book and its author was so utterly forgotten?
I think there are many reasons for that. I mean, one is the fact that it was written in Gujarati.
Hmm.
It was not written in just in Gujarati. I mean, this is a sort of a unofficial term I would use, the Parsi Gujarati. I mean, there's
Of
not
course.
much of a difference actually. So it's written in that idiom, so to speak, and the Parsis themselves, I mean, sort of grew away from that language by the 50s and 60s. So there's literally a whole library of books which have been abandoned, and Nariman Karkaria's war memoir is just one of them. It happens to be unique. That's a different thing altogether. But the very fact that the Parsis have withdrawn their investment in the language of Gujarati to a large extent, and I think that withdrawal is almost complete.
Almost complete.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
almost complete now. Uh, I think that is one of the primary reasons why there's literally about, I would say, 5,000 books published from 1815 onwards up to 1965. Maybe I may be wrong in the number. Maybe it could be 10,000 books, which are just sort of homeless now in a way. For example, the mainstream Gujarati reading public, as well as the scholars and the researchers, just somehow are not able to engage with these books at all, or do not want to engage with these books. For them, printing in Gujarati starts in Ahmedabad in 1847, not in Bombay in 1796. So I mean, they just sort of have. I mean, so it's one of that's one of the main reasons. And I think the other reason is that perhaps not enough copies were printed. Many of those copies were personal copies, which then sort of disappeared as personal libraries disappeared. It hardly made it into any proper library. And in fact, I have only discovered two copies, extant copies of that. One here in the K.R. Kama Oriental Institute in Bombay, and the other in the first Meherji Rana, Dastur Meherji Rana Library in Navsari, and nowhere else. I mean, not in any British library, which is at least in those days claimed to have, at least aspire to have, every copy of every book printed in Indian languages, does not have that book. Or if it has the book, it has not yet been catalogued. So
And that's significant, right? Because this, as you mentioned, is the only known memoir we have of an Indian soldier fighting in World War One, right?
That is correct to some extent, because I myself discovered yet another memoir in Marathi, and that memoir is written by again a soldier, but he was actually a doctor serving on the front lines, of course, and his career starts in 2018, early 2018, in Africa. So so he sort of starts his narrative in Africa, and then officially the war, the truce in 2018, but
1918, right?
no, sorry, I'm very sorry, 1918. Officially the truce was in 1918, and but then the war continued in the middle, in Iraq and the Middle East. So his regiment was, the Punjabis were posted in Baghdad, and he saw a lot of action there too. So that sort of is another First World War memoir stretching from 2018 to 1918 to 1920. So that is a Marathi memoir, and there is a Bengali memoir which has also been discovered, or it's not a memoir actually; it's a series of letters which were published much later by the mother who lost her son on the front line, and I think Amitav Ghosh has been working on that. So there are. I mean, I think if you look specifically now. I mean, now that if you have it as a target, and then you go and see, I mean, look at libraries with Tamil books, for example, or Telugu or Urdu for that matter. I think you might get even a few more, if not substantial, 400-page books. At least you might get 50-page, short accounts, or maybe if you start scanning the periodical magazines, because a lot of the newspapers are gone, but the periodical magazines might have somebody writing letters from somewhere. Who knows? I mean, all kinds of things happen. So there the people were writing. I mean, writing and publishing quite a lot even in those days. So you might still have some records, and I'm hoping that other people take up the challenge in other languages and really start focusing on finding these narratives. And I think you still might get a few more.
It's quite striking in the sense that, for World War II we have a lot of literary output of what people were experiencing, Indian soldiers were experiencing, or at least a lot of surviving sources. The contrast between World War I and World War II seems, correct me if I'm wrong, quite stark.
It's very stark, yeah. And I mean, I mean, things have not really changed too much in those 25 odd years. And for example, I mean, there's literally, I mean, if you look at the newspapers, you still have a lot of material available for the First World War. I mean, you can see the Parsis mobilizing in the newspapers, writing poems about how to sort of fight for Britannica or whatever it is, and so on. But in terms of real substantial material, memoirs, collections of letters, or even a history of the First World War, there are a few histories written in Indian languages, but they're pretty much renderings of English versions of that. So
Right.
it's not as if it's a personal insight into the war, so to speak. So yeah, I mean, that has been. I mean, it is stark. The difference is stark, and there is quite a paucity of material. So surely. And I think that sort of goes back to the 19th century, where there were so many wars, battles being fought all across India,
Of course.
and there is literally nothing at all. I mean, you look at Marathi and Gujarati. Marathi, I mean, there was so many battles which involved so many people for whom Marathi was a primary language, and there's literally no account of any of those battles. I mean, you have going back into the 18th century, you have the Panipat, Chibakar, and so on, but they are all, I mean, literally broad spectrum histories. I mean, they are not personal narratives or anything like that. So we just don't seem to have a tradition in the modern era of writing about warfare and about actual wars and battles. I mean, it just doesn't seem to have been there.
Or at least material has not survived,
It has
right?
not survived, perhaps. Yeah.
So let's return to Nariman Karkaria. Can you tell us a little bit more about this individual's life, both before and after the war?
Right. I mean, he was born in 1894 in Navsari. I mean, Navsari was a small town then, it's a small town now. And he was part of a Parsi priestly family, and that was a hereditary job. And by the time he was 15, he realized that the only future for him was white robes and blessing people in the Agyari. And I think that sort of really, and I think for a fiercely teenager, that seemed to be quite a dire future. And I think he just skipped out of home one night without too much of a plan. And as he describes it in his memoir, he reached Bombay, and then he stumbled upon a newspaper, and then he stumbled upon an advertisement for a liner going to Hong Kong. He pawned his watch and his gold chain, got some money, bought a ticket, and reached Hong Kong. And once he arrived in Hong Kong, he didn't know what to do next, and he just wandered around the streets, spotted an Indian who recognized him to be a Parsi, and then who took him to another Parsi gentleman who was perhaps the big shot of Hong Kong at that time, and that's how we got a job in a Parsi shop, and that meant, it was just a matter of chance that he got to Hong Kong without realizing. I mean, he had heard about China and its fortune. I mean, and the fortune that could be made there. But he had really no concrete plans when he left home. And then he worked in Hong Kong and Peking for 2 or 3 years. And when he went back to Peking in 1914, he realized there's a war going on, and and he doesn't really talk too much about what happens in his mind. I mean, so we don't really know how the decision to go to London was made. Why was it London and why not Bombay, where he could have volunteered for the Indian Army? But anyway, those decisions were made, and then you find him boarding the train from Peking to Manchuria, which was then occupied by Japan, and then from Japan, the Japanese Manchuria, he goes into Russia, and the Trans-Siberian Railway had just been built in 1909 or 8, I think, and he just gets a ticket all the way up to St. Petersburg, spends time I mean, there's a day's break in Irkutsk where he sees a wedding of a traditional wedding there, and then he reaches St. Petersburg and gets lost in the huge train station. But anyway, he muddles his way everywhere, all through the journey in Stockholm, and then he's there in Bergen, from where he gets a ferry to. He manages to encounter a storm in that 3 day journey, and finally he reaches London, and that journey is just so fantastic. I mean, it's fantastic now. To take the train from Peking to London would be an adventure now, and in those days when language was a real issue. I mean, he was traversing countries where about 10 different languages were spoken, and I don't think he even had picked he must have had a smattering of Chinese by then, but that would have not helped him much beyond Manchuria. So, I mean, he literally sort of managed his way all the way up to London, and in London he volunteers for the British Army. But though they tell him that to go and volunteer for the Indian Army, he somehow manages to get into the Middlesex Regiment, and that was a regiment which took people who were not British. I mean, who were volunteers. So you have Dadabhai Nauroji's grandson also, who joined the same regiment. Perhaps they were in correspondence. Maybe he found out when he reached London. I mean, from the way he writes, I think he first jumps and then looks. So, I mean, that could just be a writing style, but anyway, that's the feeling one gets as one reads the book, and but the incredible part of the story starts after he joins the army. I mean, the fact that he is there at the Battle of the Somme for many weeks and survives that battering, which, I mean, where I think the mortality rate must have been 70 to 80% on the front lines and 50% just behind that. I mean, he managed to survive that, and he manages to get back with just a foot injury. And I mean, and then that's not the end of the war for him. He then goes on to the Middle East. I mean, where he's fighting I mean, literally hand to hand battles in Jerusalem with Turkish soldiers, and having entered Jerusalem triumphantly, he's then posted to the Balkan front, which also was a quite an active front at that time. And here he was actually, for the first time, his being Indian sort of became relevant, because he was now an interpreter and trainer for the Indian soldiers who were fighting in the Balkans. He doesn't talk too much about that training and interpretation part of it, but yeah, he was there, and he was also on the medical support side. And he managed to survive three fronts, which is, I think, I'm not sure about too many soldiers who actually managed to visit all those three fronts and then came back alive from there. And
It's
then
certainly very unique.
very unique. I mean, I haven't read any English or any other language narratives which have this kind of breadth. And then the war doesn't end for him after the truce. I mean, his regiment travels to Azerbaijan, which also was still a war front of sorts. Then there is Jerusalem, and then he comes back to Turkey, and that's when he finally gets discharged after completing 4 years in the army, from early 1915 to early 1919. And then he has to go back to London to get discharged, and then come back on a military boat to Bombay. So it's a 5 year engagement effectively, and then he comes back and starts, I think, writing articles for the Jame Jamshed about his experiences, which then gets compiled into a book in 1922. And as it happened 100 years later, my translation appears.
There are a few things that really strike me about Karkaria's work. I mean, one is, I mean, when we think about the longer history of Bombay or Mumbai, uh, even though Karkaria is traveling all across the world, he is making references to Bombay. He is telling his readers, about his experiences in a cafe and comparing it to, say, what an experience would be like at an Irani cafe for a reader from Bombay. He is also talking a lot about Navsari. He is obviously very homesick for Navsari. He compares all manners of places to different things in Navsari, whether it's the Talau or the Machiwad and such. Yet at the same time, he also realizes that he can't really go back, right? That he's seen enough of the world, that Navsari is quite provincial. And the second thing that really strikes me about the work is, I think, what you talked about also is the degree of omissions, or which come out also in the way that he writes this book, right? And he's as you said, he's jumping first and thinking later. We don't really have much information of what he thinks about racial dynamics as an Indian soldier in a British regiment. He doesn't really tell us much about his reasons for fighting in the war, aside from everyone else is kind of caught up in this martial spirit. And then, of course, his own opinions about the war are kind of all over the place, right? I mean, at some times he talks about the terrible nature of the war and how this war is pointless, but at other times he's talking about kind of a martial spirit that his soldiers have, and there's kind of a elan of the soldiers that is kind of praised and brought up. It's really all over the place in terms of kind of an ideological perspective towards the war.
Absolutely. I mean, though it's 400 pages long, he's left out another 400 pages, so you can imagine. I mean, because he doesn't talk about so many things, and especially, for example, there is no name mentioned in the entire book practically. I mean, except for the first chapter where when he's growing up in Navsari, there are no names mentioned. Literally everybody. I mean, the his colleagues are as anonymous as the Germans with whom they are fighting. There are no colonels with bristling mustaches. There are no sergeants who are. I mean, nobody's named. I mean, everybody is anonymous. So I mean, I'm just trying to see, why would he do that? I mean, would he? I mean, is it because he himself was an outsider of sorts, or was it because he just didn't want to name people who are, who could have been, who had just died, maybe? Because the trauma is there. I mean, we can clearly see that he's been through quite a lot of trauma. I mean, and he describes some of those scenes in great detail, and I think in classic detail. I think some of those scenes are as classic as, as Siegfried Sassoon or whoever else you want to compare him with. So it's not as if he's devoid of emotion, but he's certainly not willing to engage with what it means to be a Indian fighting a battle for empire. I mean, that is something which is just not there. Maybe he was just not in thinking in that mold. Maybe he, I mean, but I wouldn't really look upon him as too innocent about that, because he seems to be very well read. He seems to be, a man who can think and who knows it's pointless. He's capable of evaluating the German soldiers and their bravery too,
Of course.
and
Yeah.
he's capable of evaluating German technology as compared to British technology. He's certainly not naive in any way. So there is I think a lot of authorial prerogative which he has exercised to sort of create a certain ambience in the book, which sort of propels you forward in a in a manner which sort of takes you from one adventure to another without pausing to think too much. I think that's a style which he has curated, and he has curated it very successfully. And that's the reason why you may not really see too much ruminations about the war. Though as you said, he said it was quite pointless at some points of time, but he's not ruminating too much, and he's not really willing to consider whether he's on the right side or whether there are ambiguities to the whole thing. So many of those things are missing from this narrative, and I think they're missing because didn't want to talk about them, or we specifically kept them out of that. I'm sure he must have had opinions about every of the points which you mentioned or which you talked about, but he hasn't really decided to include them in this book. Maybe there was another book waiting to be written, but which never got written.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me as one of the more unusual pieces I've written from the literature that comes from World War One. Right? I mean, you mentioned, for example, the poetry of someone like Siegfried Sassoon, and there's kind of a pervading sense of cynicism, which is representative of that generation, which had seen war, and it contrasted so greatly with kind of this Victorian ethos of progress. You have other works like Ernst Junger's Storm of Steel, a German soldier who kind of praises the manly martial spirit of World War, of fighting. Yet Karkaria still is kind of all over the place. What do you think is his purpose in writing here?
I think there has to be some connection to the Parsi psyche at that point of time. I mean, I think we cannot lose sight of that. I mean, the Parsis of India were going through a period of psychological turmoil at that time. I mean, were they Indian? Were they not? What will their status be when the inevitable independence comes? I mean, that was something. Those were questions which were already being asked, and they were wondering whether they should go back to Iran or they should go somewhere else, and are they manly enough? I mean, that is also a question which was tormenting many of the Parsis, and I think they saw themselves as a kind of a martial race which sort of was always fighting battles. I mean, they were looking at Shah Nama and Rustom Nama and those kind of semi mythological narratives which sort of which had Parsi characters, or at least the names were shared. So Rustam, Sohrab, and those kind of names, and they were still trying to reinvent their own community self image, and that meant that this war gave them some kind of a purpose of sort of fighting for something, if not the motherland, at least fighting. Just I mean, for example, when Nariman Karkaria enters Jerusalem with the allied force, he sort of says that, hey, in 500 BC, a Zoroastrian king first came in here. So I mean, so it's sort of it's a sort of a repeat. I mean, the history is being repeated as a Parsi, enters Jerusalem triumphantly. I mean, he's sort of now conflating history, which is 2,500 years old, with what is happening right now. I mean, talk about using history as a source of self creation. I mean, so that was, I think. So that was fairly creative, and I think you could get that sort of gives you a hint into why he was writing this book. I think he was writing this book to sort of tell his community that we can also fight, and we can also sort of take positions at certain points of time. And it may not have been so obvious as I'm trying to tell you right now, but I think there was a substratum of this going around. And then you find that he hasn't left the army after he comes back too. I mean, you see that his future career also was in the military. He joins the Parsi Pioneers, which was a volunteer force, and then after it was disbanded, he then continues in the Indian Army now. and he's again there in the Second World War. He's as a trainer now. He's in his 40s, presumably too old to fight in the on the front lines, but he's there in Ranchi in Bihar, which was the biggest recruiting ground for Indian soldiers, and he's training them to sort of be battle ready. So his engagement with the military is continuous. And even if you see his other book, which is Iran Bhumi Par Rakhad, which is a travelogue of 1 year's rambles across Iran on the back of a mule. A lot of Parsis visited Iran, but he is the only person to visit all the military installations. He seeks them all out, and he seems to have contacts in the Iranian military. He talks about the training, he talks about what's happening there, and so he's clearly seems to be. I mean, now that he's a war veteran, he's not just. But he seems to be really interested in the military aspects of life, and he's going on in that. So I think that his genuine interest in that field also perhaps made him write this book, not just a Parsi valorous kind of theme, which also can be looked at.
So you mentioned he wrote this other travelogue, and you of course have written a little bit about it in an article which you had published last year. And you mentioned, of course, that he had continued to serve in the Indian Army, and he dies in Ranchi, I think, just right after independence. But we know hardly anything about his life for the last few decades, right? I mean, he just
Absolutely,
seems to disappear.
Yeah, he just sort of falls from in. I mean, completely disappears. I mean, the second travelogue. He went to Iran in 1924. The travelogue appears in 1925, and that's one humongous book. I mean, it's 650 pages long, and it's got maps, and he's really analyzing Iran in the political future, the past, the history, the antiquities, the culture, the food, everything is being analyzed there. And then you sort of see that perhaps this guy is going to be a travel writer. I mean, it's that kind of a book. I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, again, a candidate for translation. It's that interesting. But after that, from 1925 onwards, I mean, I just could not get any other information about him at all. And there's one tiny obituary, which is how I found out that he was in the military and he died in Ranchi and so on. But nothing at all. I mean, nothing after the 1920s. And he lived until what 1950, 49? Yeah, after 1949. So there's, I mean, for a good 25 years, you don't see him in the public eye.
So from Karkaria, I'm going to pivot a little bit back to Bombay or Mumbai proper. Most of your work has concerned Bombay's 19th century history. This book, I guess, kind of is more at the tail end of the period of time that you look at. Though I know with J.R.B. Boy, you're also looking at things that were written in the 1950s. But most of your work has looked at the 19th century course of Bombay's history and how the city really explodes as a pan-Indian center and increasingly as a global center of everything from commerce to print to politics, scholarship. Given your in-depth familiarity with Bombay in the 19th century, how does the city look both similar and different in the 20th and 21st centuries? What major ruptures and continuities do you notice?
That's fairly.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. It's a lot. So I'm going to give. Try and answer that question in a few sentences. Bombay was amazingly cosmopolitan even in the early 19th century, and it continues to be cosmopolitan even now. Maybe to a lesser extent, you can say, because in those days you had people from all kinds of nationalities coming in and going out, and they do even now, of course, but they are overwhelmed by the natives, so to speak. But the cosmopolitanism is still there, multiplicity of languages, and I think now you hear even more languages as if you walk the streets of Bombay than what Govind Narayan describes. He sort of describes it as a Tower of Babel in a way. So yeah, that continues. But I think one factor which I would say has changed quite a lot is the ghettoization of Bombay. I mean, in the early 1800s, I could quite, quite easily say Bombay was not a ghetto. But I think the process of ghettoization starts in the 1850s, perhaps, and it's been going on slowly but surely for the last 150 years, and I think now we are pretty much, I think, at the end of that project, so to speak. So I think that is like perhaps the biggest change in Bombay. I mean, the ghettoization could be across many lines actually. I mean, it could be the rich and the poor. It could be the colonized and the colonizers. It could be. I mean now it's Hindu, non-Hindu, vegetarian, non-vegetarian, and whatever. I mean, it could be languages, it could be religion. There are so many ways you can now cut the pie up. So I think, but that, I mean, and people are doing it, I think, very consciously now, and I think that has certainly changed. I mean, for example, I mean, if you look at the old landmarks of Bombay, for example, all the Jain temples are in Paidhoni.
Hmm.
I mean, if you see, I mean, the earliest Jain temples from the 1820s and 30s, all the grand temples of the Jains are in Paidhoni, where hardly any Jains stay now, for example. I mean, and and so they have sort of moved out in a way. And again, similarly, even in all the old Christian edifices are all in Baikala, and even Baikala has been ghettoized quite a lot by now. So I mean, so things have changed quite a lot in that sense, and Bombay has now grown so much. I mean, the municipal boundaries no longer reflect the city. I mean, it never reflected the city even in the 19th century, but now it's so humongous. I mean, the metropolitan region itself, I mean, is so large, and most of the growth is happening there now in the last 25 years. I guess the island city has been degrowing for decades, and even the suburban part of the municipal Bombay is also, I guess, stagnant now. And the rest of the cities and the metropole, the new Bombay, and places which are not even called Bombay. I mean, there are so many municipal corporations which sort of surround Bombay, which are all growing at a rapid rate without the benefit of some amount of infrastructural standards which Bombay had tried to maintain. I mean, that is, I think, the lament which I think which we should be seriously considering. I mean, the certain urban sort of texture which Bombay had, I mean, is just missing, and many of them are just slums on stilts now. I mean, most of those places are growing so rapidly in such a unorganized manner. I mean, there must be some method to the madness, I hope, but
I don't
it's
think so,
yeah,
but
but yeah, I mean, I'm just clutching at straws here, but the way the growth is happening in the last few decades, and I think the growth is happening in such a manner that now the ghettoization there is the rich versus the poor. I mean, most people can no longer afford to stay here. I mean, as each neighborhood in Bombay gets developed, for example, the Bhenti Bazaar development, I mean, I think that must have displaced the bottom half of Bhenti Bazaar, or to go into the suburbs of Mira Road and Bhinder and even further beyond. So I think that's happening with every redevelopment. People are getting displaced, and I mean, that's the only way you can explain why Bombay's population fell from 2001 to, I mean, the last census was in 2011. So there was a 10% decrease in the Bombay city population, and I think if and when we ever do our next census, we will find that it has gone down even further, and not just the Bombay city, but even perhaps the Bombay suburbs also. So that has been some sort of change, and there have been many other dimensions to change. Obviously, I mean, things. I mean, things remain the same sometimes, even though they have changed. For example, I mean, one thing which always strikes me is the first train journey from what is now Victoria Terminus to Thane have happened in April 1853, and now here we are almost what 170 years later. That first train journey took 50 minutes, and even now it takes exactly the same time. I mean, so things sometimes remain the same. Obviously, we have more stations in the middle, but still, I mean, we haven't moved very far in terms of the speed at which we are traveling in. And I think, of course, the road transport has slowed down even further. So, so I mean, if you look at JRB Jijibo, he talks about the mad traffic of Bombay in the
right,
in the early 1800s. So that sort of persists even now. So most things change, more they remain the same, perhaps.
in some ways that's similar with other cities. I remember reading something recently about how the average speed of or at least the average time it would take for someone to commute on the New York City subways hasn't changed much since the 1940s. And certainly, if you look at a city like Manhattan, the population has fallen dramatically over the past 100 years. I think the population of Manhattan itself was over 2 million, and now it's just over 1 million. So there's some similarities, but I think, as you rightly point out, the method and the madness is different here, if there is any method that occurs. I mean, the pace of growth, and more importantly, the manner in which growth is happening is a bit more anarchic.
I think, yeah, that's the
To
word
put
we're
it
looking for.
lightly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, anarchic. Yeah.
So you mentioned redevelopment, and that takes me to the next thing I want to talk to you about. The pace of demolition of old Bombay or Mumbai, the old buildings that have made up the city for the past century or more, and new construction has been going on at a lightning fast pace since the end of the COVID pandemic restrictions. Aside from certain precincts in kind of the well-known parts of the city, Fort, Colaba, Marine Drive, there seems to be very little interest in the loss of this heritage and history, whether it is Art Deco buildings in places like Matunga or Shivaji Park, turn-of-the-century buildings in Girgaon, bungalows in Bandra and other parts of the western suburbs, working-class housing across Parel, Worli, Dadar, and so many other places. All of this has gone under the hammer. You can literally walk down the street one week, come back, and see familiar structures gone. And the air that we are breathing on a daily basis is quite literally thick with the dust from demolished buildings. Do you find this current movement unusual, or is it keeping more in Bombay's tradition of constantly reinventing itself, especially when that reinvention comes with a handsome profit? I mean, I think of earlier moments of real estate speculation and mass redevelopment, if we were to call it, in, say, the 1860s or the 1920s.
Yeah, I think you're right to some extent. I mean, it's nothing new really. I mean, and do we need to lament? I went and took a very long walk in Mendi Bazaar before the demolition really happened. And if you look at each structure individually, I would say go for it. I mean,
Yeah.
because the living conditions in that neighborhood
terrible.
were terrible.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
were terrible. I mean, they were. I mean, each building was so characterless, and each building was so cramped with residents who had really nowhere else to go because of the way the rent laws have been structured in Bombay and so on. I mean, there are so many imperfections which have been built into real estate in Bombay that, I mean, they were all literally wedded to that place. I mean, but if you look, I mean, there was literally nothing redeeming about that entire neighborhood individually. The neighborhood itself had a character, which no amount of sympathetic redevelopment would ever have reproduced anyway. So I think we are losing certain aspects of our city when each neighborhood gets demolished. Especially the Bendi Bazaar demolition is a wholesale redevelopment of a very large tract of land, and there wasn't much to lose there. I mean, except miserable living conditions and very, very cramped quarters. The people who are living there may not be able to, travel to sort of aspire to a much higher living standard, but just a newer structure is enough to give you a much better what do you say feel of life rather than the older one. So for each individual redevelopment, I really cannot fault the people who push for the development, and for the people who are doing it, it's a windfall profit. So I mean, you can't. So what is, for example, if you see, let's say the UK, where there are these structures with hay roofs, and I mean, whatever, early 17th century and so on. So if you go and try and sell it in the market, it's got a certain value, and to preserve it costs a certain amount of money. So all those sums are all sort of in the same sort of, let's say, ballpark. But in Bombay, that's not the case. I mean, we're talking about huge disparities in especially the way our redevelopment regulations have been formulated. There are just huge incentives which will never ever pay to keep a bungalow or a heritage structure or whatever. I mean, you would never be able to sort of match those two sums, which can be matched in other urban settings, perhaps elsewhere, because of the way they are formulating their rules, and because of the perhaps the much higher quality of their older structures. many of the structures in Bombay just are not of the quality which deserve to be. I mean, they never had a life of more than 50 or 60 years. I mean, and they have been standing for the last 100, 120 years.
Or sometimes crashing down to
Yeah,
earth
or sometimes
during the
crashing down to earth. Yeah,
monsoons.
absolutely. So I think it doesn't make too much sense in harping about heritage and all of that, because many of it is just low quality housing which really should have gone long time back. I mean, the fact that they continue to exist is because of our rent control laws, which incentivized our owners to not invest in any of those buildings, and also sort of didn't make the people tenants pay enough. So I mean, it was a lose proposition for so many years, and it's not a win-win proposition now for many of them, but at least they're sort of coming out evens. So I think I don't blame them, but there are heritage structures which can be saved and which should be saved, and I think that is a separate what do you say, a parameter altogether, which our heritage bodies have to consider, and they need to go into the suburbs and protect the heritage a bit more than they are doing right now, because all of the attention seems to be focused on the island city, and which
Absolutely.
has meant,
And certain parts of it,
yeah,
right?
and
Not the
certain
whole
parts of
city.
it, yeah, and which has meant that there has been a wholesale destruction of really good quality heritage structures in the suburbs, and because again the incentives to sort of demolish and rebuild them are so high that unless you are sort of literally pouring money from a very generous spigot into those heritage structures, it just doesn't make sense for those owners to keep it there. I mean, it's pointless. I mean, to even discuss. I mean, if you, I mean, it's like 1 and 100. I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all. As a naive heritage enthusiast, I might say, oh, we'd like to have that building in Chembur, that wonderful bungalow next to Diamond Garden. But if you're the owner, and especially if you're the owner's grandsons who have no connection to that place and to the structure, I mean, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, I think it's nice to be romantic about it as long as you don't have any skin in the game. But if you do, then I think you got to be hard nosed about it. And then the city has to be hard nosed about its own heritage. I think we are not being hard nosed there too. So we have to sort of decide that, yeah, I mean, we need to go and protect a few structures or a few neighborhoods. I mean, for example, I can just see Ballard Estate. I mean, that would be wonderful for a 50-story structures. I mean, all those 4-story buildings can be demolished, and you can have one big, huge, humongous 100-story skyscraper business block there. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. But then the city can say that, yeah, I mean, here is a really a beautiful business district which needs to be incentivized and protected, and can do that. I mean, you have to be hard nosed about that too at a certain point of time. But so it's not one rule fits all neighborhoods or all buildings, and you have to be a little sensible about it.
Yeah, my sense is that at least the way heritage preservation has worked or tried to work in India is that it has oftentimes kind of veered towards extremes. Try to preserve everything, try to maintain, the particular structures, even if those structures are well past uh, their date of expiry, or, on the other end, wholesale demolition.
Yeah. I mean, for example, in Bombay, there's hardly any structure older than 200 years. I mean, 200 years is the outer maximum. So it's not as if we're talking about very old structures. I mean, for example, like say Venice or London, which have got structures going
Absolutely
back to
not. Yeah.
1600s and so on. There's nothing like that here,
Yeah.
except for the one structure which is there, the Bombay Castle, which sort of could be at least the physical structure. Some parts of it are 400 or 500 years old. I mean but that's out of bounds. I mean,
Yeah.
so I think we need to sort of have a policy where some of these heritage structures come back to the public. I mean, security is important. I mean, I'm not even debating that point here, but I think we need to sort of be a little bit more creative about how we can restore some of our heritage structures back to public access. I mean, that can certainly be done. And and some of these buildings, so for example, even our UNESCO World Heritage structures like this CST railway station. I mean, it's surrounded by such dirty railway office blocks. I mean, the entire the place. The Indian Railways is a behemoth. They can really move all of them out, and you can really have a beautiful heritage structure, which sort of which sort of exudes the heritageness of that place, as opposed to, I mean, you step out of that place, you don't even want to step out. I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, non-heritage elements in that place which can be quite easily removed. I mean, so I think it's a matter of reclaiming some of the heritage. I mean, and I will say that for Bombay Castle too. I mean, so there you go.
That reminds me of the way I get in trouble in India the most, trespassing in areas that one is not supposed to be, but one should be allowed to go into, right? I mean, you bring up CST, for example. It's good now that they allow the public in during certain hours, but the hours are so restricted. If you look at the BMC building should be something that's open to everyone, right? And it's a beautiful, amazing building inside, but public access is very limited. We seem to have, I mean, not just in Bombay, but across India, bizarre, Byzantine, and almost Kafka-esque policies of public access. I remember being stopped once for taking a photo out of Raj Bhavan, outside Raj Bhavan in Calcutta. Now, for God's sakes, I mean, there are 100 photos of that building. One photo is not going to tip the balance of security.
Absolutely. I mean, so I think that again there is some sort of a confusion in the public sphere about what can be in the public domain and what cannot. I think a lot of our heritage is unfortunately being perpetuated from the colonial control of those heritage buildings, has been perpetuated in the current era also. I think it's for government to actually withdraw many of those structures from the current duties and restore it back to the public, and can very easily be done at
Easily.
very very low cost also. And when you mentioned the BMC, I mean every Bombay citizen has a right on the BMC structure, and but unfortunately hardly anybody ever gets to see that place now. I mean the way Bombay is moving, the administrative part of the BMC should have moved out elsewhere long time ago, and this could have been a beautiful city museum. Talking about museums, I mean, Bombay is just completely parched of them. I mean, there are so many parts of our urban heritage which need to be sort of shared with the public. I mean, people are deprived of their heritage in a way, and if some of these structures can come into the public domain, that would be wonderful.
So we're nearing the end of our recording, and I want to finish off with two questions. First question is, again, something which we could talk for a whole other episode. I know most of your work recently has been with print history. You've published numerous articles on print history in Bombay and increasingly in other parts of India. Early experiments with type, whether it's with Gujarati type or Marathi type foundries, the history of printing presses, and some of India's most prolific publishers. How does print history provide us with new perspectives on the history of Mumbai and India at large?
Okay, that's I think a very very broad question.
Episode 2,
Yeah,
perhaps.
yeah. But anyway, I mean, just to sort of do a quick recap of my work. Print history is something which sort of gave me entry into so many aspects of history, because looking at how printing developed in Bombay and in Western India from the late 1700s onwards. I mean, sort of let me in onto the intellectual and the literary culture which sort of grew up in Bombay, and which sort of was linked to the public public sphere so much that it sort of lets you know who's doing what at what point of time. And then focusing on the non-English languages of Bombay, which is basically, in the initial parts it was Marathi, Gujarati, and then Persian, and then Persian slowly gave way to Urdu, and then of course English, and then you had Portuguese also as a certain fairly major language in Bombay. And each of these languages has their own sort of culture going with it, and the way the trajectory of their print development sort of also mirrors how those the speakers of those languages participated in the public culture of Bombay. And I have sort of literally, I mean, I won't say exhausted the field, but yeah, I mean, I've written close to 100 articles on the printing history of Bombay and Western India, and then in recent times, I have sort of branched out I have also ventured out into the 20th century, looking at printing presses all across India, and not just presses, but also type foundries, printing ink manufacturers, paper manufacturers, and literally every aspect of printing which sort of one can think about. And printing is so ubiquitous and one of the most fundamental things of life, even right now, even though people are talking about digital and electronic stuff, but printing is everywhere in literally every object we touch, from the laptop which you are speaking in, which is everything is printed here. For example, I mean, all the keyboards and everything else, and product we touch is printed. Now, it's not just text we're talking about now. So it's a very fundamental aspect of life, and it it has given me insights into so many aspects of Bombay history.
And it strikes me also. I'll say one more thing about print history. I mean, when we talk about the history of industry and economic history in India, print history does not get the focus it really deserves, right? I mean, we talk about the industrialization of Bombay, whether it's the cotton industry, or we talk about ideas of deindustrialization and modern industries brought into India in the 1800s. But print is such a big part of that story, and it doesn't get the attention it
Absolutely.
deserves.
Yeah, the printing industry complains even now. It is one of the biggest employers of labor in India even now. And for example, there were presses in India in the early 20th century which employed 5,000 people. I mean, you had the railway presses of Bombay in Baikala, which had 5,000 people. The Times Press, which had 2,000 or 3,000 people. I mean, humongous. I mean, you can just imagine the kind of. It was as big as a textile plant. But but textile seems to be a more legitimate industry than printing, for some reason. I think that has been the case because printing is an area which sort of has got an element of art to it, technology to it, and it also has got some amount of let's say utility value. For example, when you're doing packaging and so on, printing versus say newspapers, which is a different thing altogether. So it's a sort of a very diversified industry. And so a newspaper printer would really have nothing to do with a packaging printer, at least in those days. So I think it didn't have that integration, in so to speak, which sort of gave it an industry status by itself. And it has always suffered that, and it continues to do so even now. But it was a huge industry by itself, and the ancillary industries were so many: the type foundries, the printing ink manufacturers, paper, and so on. So it was quite a big industry, and nobody has really looked at it from a historical perspective as a really and that has also meant that, for example, you have textile museums, but you don't have print history museums in India, for example. So that is I mean, so there are these. I mean, this has ramifications in so many other ways. I mean, how we look at the print heritage. I mean, and for example, a lot of people whom I've spoken to who are not, or who are historians, don't seem to think of print history as a legitimate topic of historical research. I mean, that has certainly changed now, but
Yeah.
but for many years it was the case that it wasn't really as history enough as, let's say, studying political or battles or kings and queens and so on. So it was much too mundane, so to speak.
Well, I mean, in my own recent research on, say, Swadeshi in the 19th century, I'm struck by how printing is a huge component of that movement. I mean, people are inventing different types of ink, they're manufacturing paper, and of course, the whole process of Swadeshi was to a very large degree dissemination of publications, newspapers, and so it's very much there, but it's not really been appreciated that much by historians. And that brings me to my final question, which is, I'll focus on the fact that you are an independent historian. And luckily for you, and perhaps unluckily for people like me, that means that you can sidestep a lot of the arcane debates that take place amongst academic historians. I want to ask you, based on your readings of Bombay's history and your knowledge of the languages and archives here, especially the archives, what, in your opinion, has been missing in the academic scholarship? What themes, directions, and archival sources would you recommend pursuing for those of us who are, for better or worse, trapped in the academic ivory tower?
Well, I think the only luxury I have enjoyed, you call me independent, I will use the word unaffiliated historian, is that there's been no, what do you say, uh, pre- pressure to publish, pressure to focus on certain topics, pressure to sort of further certain agendas. So basically, I can do whatever I want to do, and I can stretch my research in such a manner that I can actually go and excavate a lot more than, let's say, if you're working against a deadline or so on and so forth. And I can also do a lot of trawling. I mean, by trawling, I mean I can sort of through a very, very vast net, collect a lot of material, and then keep them, classify them, and use them whenever I want it much later. So I mean, so that's a luxury which I have, which perhaps historians with teaching commitments and evaluations and paper settings and conferences may not have. But a lot of people, I mean, I'm not saying that they don't do that. They also, a lot of people do that too. So that's one of my luxuries, let us put it that way. And another thing which I've focused on is I've focused on non-English material, which I think a lot of the historians who are working on general history are not focused on.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, so example, I mean, if you're working on Urdu history, then you would obviously look at Urdu material. But if you're working on just history, I mean, Urdu would just not be part of your of your target languages. I mean, and even it's only now that people are looking at Marathi and Gujarati in a proper. I mean, Gujarati is still, I think, sort of a stepsister of Marathi even now. I think, but I think. I have been focusing on non-English languages, Marathi, Gujarati, and then I learned how to read Urdu so that I could start reading Urdu newspapers and magazines and books printed in Bombay. And Bombay was a major center for Urdu. I mean, much as the North Indians may not like that statement, but it was. And so there is literally a huge amount of material which has just not been read by almost any historian or any researcher of any kind. And so I mean, I find that that's the biggest lacuna. And I mean, if you ask me what is missing and what should we focus on, I think we should focus on non-English sources. And I think even the Portuguese sources, especially the Portuguese sources in the 19th and 20th centuries, have just not been read. And I think there's a lot of material there relating to both Western India and to Bombay, which can be recovered from that. I mean, which is, I think, a shame, because even the Goan historians are not reading Portuguese any longer. So it's quite a shame, because we lost a whole language. We have lost two languages. Persian we have lost, and when I say lost, I mean a vast majority of our researchers don't use that language and don't want to use that language. Similarly, Portuguese is another language we have lost, and I think if we're not careful, we might even lose Urdu too. I think those are the areas I would focus on.
Great. Well, thank you, Murali, for joining me for this particular conversation. There's certainly a lot that we can bring up for perhaps a future episode to talk more on the history of Bombay.
Thank you so much, Linyan. It was nice being here.